delighted that we've managed to gather such a coalition of people today. Postal workers and rail workers and teachers and health workers and local government workers.
It's a February Saturday in Edinburgh, and several hundred anti-racists have turned out to demonstrate against a threatened street protest by the Scottish Defence League, a group widely thought to be affiliated to the UK's far-right British National Party, the BNP.
The BNP is a Nazi party! The BNP is a Nazi party!
On the city's Royal Mile, a tense face-off between skinheads and anti-Nazis. Members of the SDL have been drinking in a pub there, and their opposite numbers have found out where they are.
Tell me why I should join you.
Over 700 police have been drafted in to oversee the standoff and prevent violence.
You don't? Where do you come from? Where do you come from? Where do you come from? Where do you come from?
It's not against Muslims, it's against radical Islam. It's against all the mosques that are springing up. It's against the Sharia tribunals.
Answer my question. Where do you come from? You can't answer questions.
That's not really your business, is it?
We are being outnumbered. British people are being outnumbered.
SDL members are eventually bussed out of the city with a police escort, to the jeering delight of their opponents. Back at the Princes Street Gardens beneath the city's castle, peace, justice and solidarity are recurring themes of the rally speakers.
The politics of fear and intolerance, promoting ignorance and hatred.
These people are out here on a cold winter's day because they are committed and passionate in their opposition to racism, prejudice and the abuse of human rights. Indeed, for some, their lives are defined by it.
An injury to one is an injury to all, and we look further than beyond our own backyard is something that gives me immense pride, and that's something which is reflected around Civic Scotland.
Among this crowd of anti-racists are 5 activists from the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, a group committed to drawing attention to and mobilising peaceful action against what they consider to be a criminal racist state. But they staged a protest only to find themselves in court on racism charges and at the heart of a test case about the entire right to political dissent.
I didn't know anything about the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. I read the papers kind of every day, and when I go to the Palestine-Israel issue, I thought, well, it's just religion. This is really complicated.
I remember I was walking through the streets with Vanessa, and on a number of occasions in different places, I saw a poster of a young boy throwing a stone towards a massive tank, and it was advertised in a public meeting. And I saw this so many times, and Vanessa as well, that eventually we thought, you know, what is this?
It's a really difficult issue for people to get involved, I think, because the mass media tried to make it really difficult.
First thing that we did was we checked a map just to find out where it was, and on the map that I had at home, it didn't have any mention of Palestine. So that was the first shock. Of course, you know, it's easy enough to do a search on the internet and you'll find it, and then more information comes out.
I had previously been involved in the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, so we came up with a not very creative name of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign.
We were invited to go and spend some time in Palestine as part of a Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign delegation, so we did that.
I knew a bit about the history before I went and about what was happening on the ground, but nothing prepares you to see it. I mean, really, it's a shock. The wells where people normally get water have been cemented over. They cannot build anymore. And obviously, if you try to travel to the next village, then there will be checkpoints.
Seeing things firsthand, speaking to people and just seeing the ridiculous situation that they have to live in.
Across the West Bank, Palestinians, with increasing support from Israeli Jews and international activists, stage weekly protests at points along the separation barrier as it cuts its way through villages and farms.
When you start to see the reality, it's very easy. It's about land, about colonialism, about injustice. We changed from Stop the War and Palestine to just Palestine, really, because we thought if you do one thing but you do it well, it's much better than trying to do many things.
The way that the situation is portrayed over here, just so far from reality, it just makes you want to try and do something about it.
And that's who we are. We became the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and we've been working to educate people in Scotland ever since. And over the last few years, we've really focused in on the Palestinian appeal for boycott, divestment and sanctions against anything associated with the Israeli state. Speaking personally, my initial thinking was when I read about these characters that for the three of them who were Russian immigrants, a rifle in one hand and a violin in the other is the ultimate Zionist statement. I thought that was just a provocation to any decent person.
The fact that they're Israeli doesn't qualify them for a protest at all. There are lots of Israelis who would protest alongside us. In fact, when I was in Palestine last, there were Israelis who were protesting alongside us within the West Bank.
The Jerusalem Quartet are cultural ambassadors for the State of Israel.
Their job description and the contract that they sign essentially locks them into promoting, and I'm quoting here, promoting the policy interests of the State of Israel.
The Israeli ambassador in the US stood up and introduced them to the concert goers in a big hall in Washington, I think it was.
I was earlier involved with lots and lots of other people in a campaign led by a guy who's currently, I think, a British government minister, Peter Hain, who organised something called Stop All Racist Tours during the campaign against South African apartheid.
As was the case with apartheid in South Africa, representatives of the state, ambassadors for the state, didn't get a free ride. There was a protest waiting for them whenever they toured the world, and that made a difference.
Some of us, stopped the Springboks. And I thought we should do exactly the same thing.
So we knew we wanted to do some sort of protest, and to make the point about boycott, we wanted to raise the issue of Gaza, because at the time a lot was happening in the news about the Gaza blockade. Our governments aren't doing anything, so we have to take action.
I was actually one of the protesters outside the venue. There was a group of about 35 of us. I arrived with my son. We're both involved in a Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign.
As well as the people who were outside waving the placards, there was about 5 of us who went inside.
They're really quite an elderly audience, music lovers in some cases, but we're giving them a leaflet and trying to sort of engage them in a little bit of conversation.
At least one of the people that went inside did so using a ticket that had been handed in by a potential audience member, someone who had bought a ticket but decided not to go in after he had heard of the reality of the concert that he was supporting.
The moment was approaching for the concert to start, I thought I might as well take use of these one of these tickets.
So we had a good number of people protesting outside, and some of us went inside to interrupt the performance.
Well, I wasn't particularly brave. I did offer it to anyone who would take one. So of course it was me, and I went in.
I was so nervous, I could only hear my heart.
It was a morning performance during the Edinburgh Festival, and I went in beside a guy talking to him, and he said, "Oh yes, Israel's a barbaric state, what they're doing to the Palestinians is absolutely awful." And then I heard him saying to his partner, it would be absolutely awful if they were to heckle the performers. I think in the scale of atrocities, genocide comes a little bit above having your musical performance disrupted.
I did know that there were other protesters inside who I didn't exactly know what was going to happen next.
The first person to stand up was Mick, who's the chair of the SPAC.
These are Israeli army musicians.
Some of the audience were a bit annoyed, as you might expect. The way that he was ejected quite aggressively by security guards prompted someone who was close by to say, you know, do you need to be quite so rough? And apparently he was ejected as well. One after the other, separately. We stood up and disrupted the performance.
All 5 of us made different points, some shorter than others, shouting boycott Israel.
Boycott Israel!
Israel is killing people in Gaza. We all know that they are killing people in Gaza. You with your silence are killing people as well.
The performance was stopped. The Jerusalem Quartet left the stage on most occasions, and whoever it was then ejected by security guards, and once outside, arrested by the police.
So they asked me to get out of the rows, and obviously I just kept talking.
We know that they are killing people in the waistband, and I said we need to stand up.
But when they asked me to move, I actually moved. But one of them was hurting me in my hand quite a lot. So I said to him, "Look, you're hurting me. If you don't stop, I'm going to report you." So it was rough. It was quite rough, yeah.
We were kept in the cells for a number of hours, and then subsequently charged with breach of the peace. In the 6 months between the actual protest and the trial, obviously what we had was Gaza.
Under attack, Israel's Air Force unleashes devastation on the Gaza Strip. On the ground in one of the world's most densely populated areas, it's a gruesome scene. This Palestinian policeman prepares for his end.
Whatever the mechanism is that is acceptable to the Israeli government to not see violence used against its citizens, then of course we're not going to stand in the way of that.
45% of the casualties, dead and wounded, are women and children. He also said in a bit that wasn't included there, 25% of the casualties he'd seen today were children.
I want to really emphasize this, that we are targeting Hamas infrastructure in mosques, universities, schools.
But you're
they are
killing
sheltering
women and children and civilians.
Because they are using human shields. They're using the civilians.
But you
They're
knew
shooting.
that before you started, didn't you?
Look,
so my question was, what do you hope to achieve by it?
I'm saying that at a certain stage a nation has to stand up and say enough is enough.
1 week before the trial, the Procurator Fiscal said that she'd actually decided to drop the case of breach of the peace and bring forward new charges based on new evidence that our protest was racially motivated.
I was the one saying, well, the PF cannot do that, that's unjust. Suddenly, 1 week before the trial, changing the charge.
We saw the evidence that was against us for the breach of the peace. We've seen the evidence that's against us for the racially aggravated conduct charge, and there's absolutely no difference whatsoever. So there's no new evidence that's been disclosed, and obviously we're entitled to disclosure.
If they upheld the charge, it will be really negative. The personal consequences will be terrible. I mean, 6 months jail, that's the top. I don't think it will happen, but you never know.
There's a lot at stake, of course, but I feel I've got a very, very strong argument.
Working in a university, a professional career, I mean, it's out of the window. You lose your job, and then you have a criminal record which says that you're a racist.
There was absolutely no racist remarks made whatsoever, and I did mention earlier on there were Jews demonstrating on the very demonstration outside.
It was never about Jews. It was never about racism as we know it, Jim. There are Jews in the campaign. The president of the campaign is Jewish. There's many fantastic Jewish people around the world support the campaign for justice in Palestine.
Jeff Halper is a professor of anthropology and is the co-founder and director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He lives in East Jerusalem.
The charge of racially aggravated conduct is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, race shouldn't be, obviously, the basis of any kind of behavior, and racism should be illegal. But it's not racism when you're dealing with the oppressive policies of a country. Israel's a country, not a race.
One thing that we were very keen on having, especially when the racism charge materialised, was a recording that was made by the BBC. Now, they didn't seem very keen to pass that on. Eventually, they insisted on having a court order before they passed it on, so that was eventually got. When you actually see the transcript, it's quite clear that actually we said nothing about Jews.
Jodie McIntyre is a young journalist who spent much of 2009 in Gaza and the West Bank and was living with a Palestinian family when they were evicted from their home in East Jerusalem.
This is ridiculous, the charge they are faced with. It's got nothing to do with racism if people are calling for a lift of the siege on the Gazan people. If there are charges of racism, then they should be levelled at the war criminals of the Israeli government who act with impunity and then come to visit our foreign officials for a cup of tea in London. These are the real criminals we should be prosecuting, not people like the SPSC5 who are standing up on the side of justice.
Dr. Ezra Golombok is the nearest thing to an Israeli consul official in Scotland and a vocal critic of the SPSC. But even he seemed perplexed by the charge.
I mean, I could understand that they arrested them for a disturbance of the peace. That seems obvious. Why did he try and make it into a racially aggravated offence? Which is much more difficult to prove, and I don't think it was, in terms of what the law says is racial incitement.
Human rights says that there are certain standards by which we all have to conduct ourselves. This was an action that was done against the political policies of Israel and the occupation that's oppressing Palestinians.
Ghada Kami is a leading Palestinian activist, academic and writer. Born in Jerusalem, currently a research fellow at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at Exeter University.
This charge should be thrown out. It is outrageous, and it is motivated by a desire to shield Israel from criticism. Now, why should that be?
I think Israel was really worried about the boycott and about their image after Gaza.
Gaza had happened. and there was a very increased and vocal criticism of Israel, of the reality of Israel. And maybe there was some kind of pressure to make sure that Israel was aware that the state was still on its side. The people maybe not, but the state, yes.
Though the political fallout from Operation Cast Lead may well be a factor in the change of charge from breach of the peace to racially aggravated conduct, a significant event also took place shortly after the Gaza ceasefire at London's Lancaster House.
Within the weeks before the change in the charge, a statement was produced as a result of a conference that took place in London. The statement was the London Declaration on Anti-Semitism. The text asks signatories to condemn anti-Semitic discourse on campus, including calls for boycott of Israel.
It's a very, very specific attempt to criminalise boycott, to say it's racist.
Support Palestine, boycott Israel, thank you. Support Palestine, boycott Israel, thank you. Palestina,
yes.
Israel.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. ¿Vacaciones? ¿Estáis de vacaciones aquí?
It's absolutely disgusting.
Support the Palestinians, thank you. Support Palestine, thank you. Support Palestine.
You can boycott Israel just like you boycotted South Africa in the apartheid days. There's boycotts of Sudan. When Milosevic or Charles Taylor from Liberia are brought up for war crimes, that's not a racial thing. You know, sanctions against Burma, sanctions maybe against China over Tibet, all those are against countries. I don't know where the racial part of it comes.
But there is an opposing viewpoint, and Ezra Gollenbach's misgivings are increasingly echoed by supporters of Israel to explain the activities of its critics.
If you listen to what they say, or the pro-Palestinian groups, or but even worse, the Arab groups, they are repeating exactly the same thing that Jews suffered in medieval times.
What the Zionists always try and do is to conflate anti-Zionism or protest against the state of Israel with anti-Semitism.
They always say it's anti-Israel and not anti-Semitic, but you can't. But it's very difficult to separate them because you find exactly the same patterns.
The growing preoccupation with the perceived re-emergence of anti-Semitism is reflected by a new wave of books on the subject, including one most recently by well-known lawyer and academic Anthony Julius.
Hello, my name is Anthony Julius. I'm the author of a book with the title Trials of the Diaspora, A History of Anti-Semitism in England. As the title indicates, it's a book about the hatred, intent towards Jews in England across an extended time span, about the middle of the 12th century to the present.
I think today the biggest cause of anti-Semitism, which is on the rise, is Zionism.
The kind that dominates now is associated with, but not identical to, the anti-Zionist project, the project of attacking and subverting the very conception of the possibility of a Jewish state.
Israel calls it the new anti-Semitism, and it's intended to intimidate people, which is what it does.
We saw in the trade unions with the academic boycott, where the trade union was intimidated really with a threat of legal action.
The whole thing should be thrown out, should never be dealt with, there should never be that conflation. That's an Israeli invention.
Most people, myself included, would accept that anti-Semitism is a form of racism, but only in the same way as Zionism is a form of racism.
Written in 1896 by Theodor Herzl, Der Judenstaat, the State of the Jews, was the core text of the Zionist movement, and argued that the best way to avoid anti-Semitism in Europe was to create an independent Jewish state.
קיבלה עצרת האומות המיוחדות החלטה המחייבת
Israel's declaration of independence in 1948 was the culmination of the movement's aspiration. But Zionism remains a powerful ideology, with considerable support and funding from the world's superpower. Ezra Gollenbach states the Zionist case clearly.
A Jewish state is a state which is, say, like founded on Jewish principles. It admits people who have suffered because of Judaism. Well, that's not unfair, or whose ancestors suffered, so that they can have a place where they are of right.
But if Zionism is a movement carrying the homeland agenda of strongly nationalist Jews, both within Israel and elsewhere, it is also seen as the vehicle for dismantling the hopes of Palestinian Arabs for a cultural and national identity of their own.
When you have a political ideology falsely claiming to be representative of the Jewish people and Jewish people around the world, that is then responsible for the war crimes that were committed in Gaza and the crimes that are being committed every day, the ethnic cleansing in East Jerusalem, kicking Palestinian families from their home to make way for foreign colonialist settlers. This is the biggest cause of anti-Semitism.
I'm not saying Israel acts well. It doesn't. Israel makes lots of mistakes, and probably a degree of cruelty in the West Bank too, but not as much as is made out.
The settlements in the West Bank, illegal under international law, are now cities as 500,000 Israeli settlers.
Why shouldn't they be there? I mean, you have plenty of foreigners working here, don't you? I think Israel has a just demand to be accommodated there. And all it's asking is, give us a space to live. Unpleasant is the fact that Israel, assuming control over certain areas, is going to stay, particularly Jerusalem. It's going to stay, and areas, parts of the West Bank as well. To be honest, I don't know when the Arabs are going to wake up to the realities. They cannot accept the fact that they have been defeated, that the best thing for them is to work with what could very well be a benevolent, superior power.
But beyond the politics and the military might, and to some extent underpinning it, there is also a theologically derived narrative.
Abraham's first spouse was Hagar, whose son was Ishmael. And then Abram, Rebekah's, much to everyone's surprise, had a son, Isaac, who became the progenitor of the Jewish race, and Ishmael became the Arab. The Isaac side has become very sophisticated. The Ishmael side was, no, I don't say primitive, but very earthy. They're not very wildly happy, but they live quite well. They are not satisfied with the fact that they are, in a sense, second-class citizens. They're treated as not the same as Jews. Well, but do you not have that here? Would you not say that the Muslims feel that they complain that they're treated as second-class citizens?
In Israel's Declaration of Independence, freedom and equality for all of its citizens are clearly stated principles. But in a state that designates itself Jewish, yet whose population is 20% Arab, there are obvious pressures on such democratic ideals.
I don't think there will ever be a solution in one state, because all that would happen would be that the Arab population would soon exceed the Jewish population, and Israel would disappear as a Jewish state.
Here, a Palestinian family recently evicted from their East Jerusalem home and now living in a tent outside look on as the new European settler occupants, together with the construction workers helping them to gut the building, loiter across the street.
I have difficulty justifying it. I mean, even if I'm supposed to, I'm not supposed to. I'm supposed to talk about Israel, not about the individuals in it. There are extreme elements, but not all of them are extreme. They have a case. They believe they have an historic right to be there, that God gave them this country.
But even if politics, history and belief are used to justify current Israeli oppression of Arabs, there remains the question of when the motivation becomes something darker. A pregnant Palestinian woman is depicted framed by the crosshairs of a rifle and with the caption, "One shot, 2 kills." This t-shirt design, together with others of a similar sentiment, has proved popular with IDF soldiers. Media exposure forced a modest rebuke from their superiors, but it does little to support the long-held claim by Israel to have the most moral army in the world. But for all the apparent injustice taking place in the name both of Zionism and the Judaic belief in a biblically sanctioned claim to Palestine, it is anti-Semitism that remains the overriding issue for many who champion the State of Israel.
So although the book has a long historical reach, it also has a somewhat urgent and immediate preoccupation. I hope that people reading the book will, as a result, take the problem that I address seriously.
Most people find it incomprehensible that lifelong anti-racists such as Sophia, Neil, myself and others get charged with racism.
Now you get anti-Semitism in the form of Mick Napier, because it is anti-Semitic. I mean, it's obvious to me that his inspiration, as I said, he's using anti-Zionism because it suits his left-wing tendency, but basically he's anti-Jewish.
But such convictions as these have sometimes led to controversy. A recent book published by the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities included accusations of the SPSC as anti-Semitic, remarks inserted after a foreword had already been written and submitted by Scottish First Minister Alex Salmond. The campaign group raised a legal action in response to this defamation attempt, and 6,000 copies of the book's first edition had to be pulped.
These Israeli supporting organisations are doing a disservice to people suffering from real anti-Semitism by using this charge as a political tool.
All of which brings us back to the London Declaration.
There's a recommendation that the document be used to inform the judiciary and the law enforcement agencies in each country. Gordon Brown was the first head of state to sign that document, and maybe, just maybe, the Procurator Fiscal, felt that it would be good for her career if she did something that she felt the establishment would be happy with. That may well explain the change in the charge.
With 18 months and over a dozen court appearances since the Jerusalem Quartet took their bows at the Queen's Hall, the SPSC 5 case was finally nearing a judgment.
We've been here about 14 times. I have to say that most of the processes have been unbelievably tedious and procedural, but today the Procurator Fiscal, for the first time, is going to make an intensely political speech in a Scottish court and will attempt to say the definition of racism should be expanded to cover vigorous and dedicated anti-racists.
We are standing up for justice decency, against racism, and we're coming up against the Edinburgh Procurator Fiscal. Thank you everybody for coming here today. We'll be back as long as it takes to secure victory and justice for the people of Palestine.
While the hearing at Edinburgh Sheriff Court got underway, an act of solidarity was about to take place in London's Wigmore Hall, where the Jerusalem Quartet were performing a lunchtime concert. This time the protest included members of JBIG, Jews for Boycotting Israeli Goods, one of whom started things off with an operatic reference to East Jerusalem.
Well, I'm afraid that due to disruption we've had to leave that concert live from Wigmore Hall. Many apologies. Do stay with us as the music continues shortly.
Back in Edinburgh, the latest court hearing is over. Human rights lawyer and solicitor for one of the five, Amma Anwar, summarises.
Well, that's the debate over today. The sheriff will give his decision on the 8th of April, which will decide whether the charge should be struck out, i.e. whether incitement to racial hatred is a valid charge or not.
5 of them interrupted the concert in London at 1 o'clock, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and none of them were arrested.
Yeah,
did the same thing.
One of the protesters was an opera singer, so she did it very much more entertainingly than I did. Anyway, they were ejected and that was it.
With the news that the Wigmore Hall protesters were ejected without further action, the SPSC5 retired to a coffee shop to discuss implications for their own case and prepare for the sheriff's final verdict in a week's time.
The Scottish Palestinian Solidarity Campaign that demonstrated have a right under the European Convention to demonstrate and to protest, and I do not believe that the law of the Public Order Act was created to criminalise people who are protesting against war crimes.
People like these 5 accused are brave. They are trying to express their sympathy and solidarity for the Palestinian people who suffered so much at the hands of Israel.
If we were to lose this case, then potentially what it could mean is that, as the Procurator Fiscal said today, that if anybody to use the terms genocide in Gaza on a public demonstration on the street, or let's say standing at a stall, then they could face a prison sentence as a result and be accused of racial conduct. That's unacceptable in a democracy.
We welcome today's judgment, which impacts on civil liberties in Scotland.
The case was deserted simpliciter, which means that the charge as it stands is now thrown out.
We welcome what the sheriff said and did today. He ridiculed and satirised the Procurator Fiscal's efforts to protect a foreign state, in this case Israel, from criticism.
Freedom of expression and the right to protest, of course, carry responsibilities, but a dangerous precedent will be set if protesters were to be criminalised for racism, for protesting against state genocide.
The Scottish Council of Jewish Communities published a book, right, in which they accused us of demonising Jews. We have Jews and Gentiles in our membership. There is no trace of anti-Semitism in what we do.
The law itself is very, very dangerous because I think the law as written is so vague. Until it's tested in court in this way.
In terms of the sheriff, what he said was that it would be an impossible position to really be in if you had people on a public protest that wishing to protest against state genocide were not allowed to refer to the country that was carrying out the genocide.
You can't define race, so then defining racism, you get in a complete twist, and half the definition is circular, and then the other half is things that don't really seem to be anything to do with race.
If you can't refer to the state of Israel, you would have to carry placards saying, "We are protesting against genocide by an unspecified country in the Middle East."
Thank you, man. Thank you for your support.
Though jubilant at the outcome of the case, it's business as usual for the SPSC5. There are press releases to be posted and a growing campaign of boycott, divestment and sanctions to be organised and supported.
The stuff that you fancy?
Now, what is it all about then?
Basically, we're promoting the boycott of Israel generally, and we're outside Waitrose specifically because of their attitude to Israel.
5 people in this audience here were on trial for racism. Imagine to be accused of racism for opposing a vicious apartheid state where Jews are superior to Arabs from birth to death. Thank God Sheriff Scott laughed the whole thing out of court. Let's toast Sheriff James Scott. He had a twinkle in his eye. It wasn't the worst.
Even at the victory party, there was a sober reminder of the potential hazards of embracing activism with passion alone.
We're very lucky because we were organised. Individuals get picked off. And a year ago, when Israel was massacring people in Gaza and dropping white phosphorus on folk, young people turned up outside the Israeli embassy for the first time in their life. They'd never demonstrated before. But there are young guys been sent down in London for 1 year, 2 years for throwing an empty water bottle at the Israeli embassy. They're being sent down for solidarity with Gaza. They're being criminalised. They're in prison tonight as we speak for solidarity with Gaza. And Judge Dennis...
But in Israel, on the West Bank, suppression of protest is even more severe. As Jeff Helper has observed from the ground in East Jerusalem, every organisation and individual in Israel concerned about peace, human rights, international law and justice is now a target, as rising numbers of activists are arrested and detained for demonstrating against house demolitions, land theft and the wall.
Families are willing. We bring hundreds of Israelis out and rebuild the houses. And so it's a joint Israeli-Palestinian act of resistance, act of solidarity, something I think
we will see this more and more, because the Israeli government are very afraid of what they have called a campaign of delegitimization.
I think the state of Israel is upping the ante. And I think the reason they're doing so is because they can feel the heat from the sustained criticism that's coming from around the world, and especially in the form of boycott. I think they're really upset about that.
The effect of what the Crown did, or the Procurator Fiscal did, was to give them a license to repeat this.
Boycott Israel, support Palestine.
This isn't even a matter of standing with Israelis or Palestinians. This is a matter of right and wrong.
Now they've not only not got a record of having offended, which they clearly did, but they have been told it was alright.
Nelson Mandela was a terrorist until a few years ago, so I think it should be a compliment for people on the side of justice to be considered an enemy of the Israeli state.
How did the Israelis learn that they can kill and steal and murder and oppress?
The majority of level-headed people are starting to realise that this is crimes against humanity that are being committed.
Don't get mad, get even. Boycott is the way to get them in the wallet, and boycott's the way we can punish the Israelis.
What the Procurator Fiscal has done is elevate them from a nuisance to a political organisation, and that's a shame.
People like the SPSC5 are doing a great service to the Palestinian people, and in the future these are the people that will be remembered as the heroes.
I'm absolutely sure that Palestine one day is going to be free. There's a Mandela Square in Glasgow. Shamefully, there's none here. There will be a Palestine Square, and we'll dance there.